Who do you hold responsible for that?
All those people who perpetrated such an empire and such a trail of betrayal.
Betrayal?
Yes, for development program of the country.
Tiny Rowland says he loves Africa.
Because Africa has enriched him, so he would love it.
Tiny Rowland now became a close friend of Jim Slater and the other takeover tycoons. They dined together at the Claremont and sold each other companies. All of these new tycoons were making fortunes by tearing up an old system of industrial power that had dominated Britain and its empire for over 100 years. But they were about to become even richer and even more powerful. And yet again it was to happen by accident, as the politicians desperately tried one more time to make Britain's ailing economy grow.
The Queen has asked me to form the next government, and I am indeed proud to accept. To govern is to serve. This government will be at the service of all the people, the whole nation.
In 1970, the Conservatives were returned to power, led by Edward Heath. Heath presented himself as a new kind of politician. He rejected the Keynesian idea that governments could control the economy. He would give up government intervention in industry and let the lame ducks go to the wool. It was the Thatcherite philosophy, 10 years ahead of its time. But the consequences were terrifying. Within months, scores of factories closed and unemployment soared. And in 1971, Rolls-Royce, Britain's most famous company, declared it was bankrupt. Heath decided the experiment had failed. The government would reassert control over the economy.
We are not prepared to tolerate the human waste and suffering that accompany persistent unemployment. We stand by those words today. The measures we have taken this year are proof of our determination to expand the economy, but to do so on sound foundations and to bring down the level of unemployment.
Heath now went to the other extreme. He poured money into the economy. He increased government spending and relaxed borrowing. It was called the Dash for Growth.
Yes, Jim, over.
55,000 crude, 25, please, over.
I confirm you want to buy 55,000 crude.
But much of the money went into creating a stock market bubble that did nothing to make industry more efficient. Above all, it was invested in the new companies of the takeover men. And Jim Slater's share price soared to astounding heights.
Well, the nearest 25, I'd offer you 50 at the moment.
It was a pretty heady time, really. The stock market always went up. I know stories of people going into the old stock market where you walked onto the floor and they saw shares like Slater Walker and so on there and bought for themselves, not for their clients, some shares, went to the loo and come back and they'd sort of made about 25% on their money. And so they sold them again and made profits. Well, the trouble is that's not reality. No company can move in value like that. So you're actually getting a bubble.
Well, then if you bought the shares, they were bound to go up. So you didn't do anything, you just bought the shares and they went up. For some of these people, some of the great names. And that expectation allows them to use the share, increase share price, allows them to use the share to go and buy something. Because shares are nothing more than sort of supercharged pounds, really. You can use them to buy other companies.
Which they did.
Which they did. And you can use them to raise more money in the stock market.
Using the power of his extraordinary share price, Jim Slater now became the dominant force in the City of London. He set up his own banking operation and a network of satellite companies, each of which set about asset stripping British industry. He gave thousands of pounds to the Tory party, while his former partner, Peter Walker, became a cabinet minister. Jim Slater was now all-powerful.
I did become a bit arrogant, I think, about what I was doing, the business side, I would say. Probably still am.
What do you mean?
Well, I think if you're reading in the press things like this, the master has just done this, and, you know, how wonderful it all is, and how clever it is, and all that. You keep reading it. In the end, you sort of start to believe it. You begin to feel you're walking on water a bit. It was thin ice, in fact.
How dangerous was that for you?
It's not desirable, is it? It's going to end up in some sort of problem.
Jim Slater became a partner of the politicians. Ted Heath invited him to become an unofficial advisor to the government. And the whiz kids who ran his satellite companies portrayed themselves as new kinds of industrialists. They were working with government to reconstruct and modernise Britain. The takeover tycoons had finally supplanted the old captains of industry. They had forged a new partnership with politicians. But what few people realised was that their success was based on a facade. They were doing nothing to reconstruct British industry. They were merely profiting from its decline. But drunk on this moment of power, they portrayed themselves as the inheritors of the great industrialists of Britain's past.
If you look back to the great days of British industry, the days when we controlled 23% of the world's trade as opposed to about 9% now, when all these great legendary companies were founded, they were all founded, without exception, by capitalists, industrialists, financiers, whatever you want to call them, with a face. Now, all these men who founded these companies were tough, ruthless, ambitious, and not necessarily likable men.
But the tycoons' brief moment of power was about to be destroyed. By 1973, it was clear that Heath's dash for growth had failed. It had created rampant inflation, and when the government tried to hold down wages, it led to violent strikes. The politicians privately believed they were losing control of the country. In one last attempt to control the economy, Heath decided to slam the brakes on. He announced an immediate freeze on wages, prices, and profits. The idea that profits would be restricted panicked the stock market, and the bubble finally burst. Share prices began to slide. This was a disaster for the tycoons, because their share price was their only source of power. Goldsmith immediately sold off practically all his companies, as did Jim Slater, but he found it more difficult.
Unfortunately, we were in a lot of our liabilities, on property in particular, were difficult to get out of. So although I could see it coming, I was selling off companies, left, right and centre. But in the end, I was stuck, for want of a better word.
Tiny Rowland was also stuck. Try as he could, he found it impossible to siphon enough profit out of his African companies to support his share price. So he created fake profits.
The profits of Lonhro were false. What Rowland did was, with all the companies, all these 300 companies, where they traded with each other, and a lot of them did a lot of intercompany trading, he just added all the sales figures together and consolidated them in one set of accounts, which were produced in London for the stock exchange, of course.
Well, we've just had the quarterly figures of Lonhro, which is one of our mining companies, and the figures are entirely in line with our expectations. They have made no announcement about nothing at all. No,
it looks like a very encouraging report. Call them better on it. Call them 71.3. 71.3. Yeah.
Good news every time. Wonderful news. Bigger profits, bigger turnover, and so on.
And it wasn't true.
On the whole, no, it wasn't true. It wasn't true. It was false reporting.
At this point, the establishment decided to turn and fight. The old directors Rowland had placed on his board as trophies were told by the accountants about the false profits. They also discovered that Rowland had made secret payments to an ex-Tory minister called Duncan Sands. Rowland had bribed him to become chairman and make Lonhro look respectable. To the old directors, this was corrupt, and they voted to sack Tiny Rowland as chief executive.
They waited for an opportunity when Mr. Rowland was out of the country, traveling the Africa and the Gulf states, and it was only when I overheard a telephone conversation in the street. Mr. Rowan was out having a meeting,